Well, here we are with another guide, this time for Wave 2 of the DLC Emblems. As always, we'll try to make this as comprehensive as possible and place each emblem on our tier list. If you haven't watched the other parts, that should be totally fine. But if you really don't know how emblems work or what kind of different skills there are, I'd maybe go back and check them out. But without further ado, let's jump into it. We'll start with the Bracelet of the Brass General, Hector. And I'll be honest, I think Hector can be good, but has some problems. Like Ike, he's a defensive emblem, granting you +5 defense on equip, as well as some strength and build. He also gives you access to the engage skill Impenetrable, which increases defense and res by 30% while you're engaged with him, so long as the enemy initiates attacks. Unlike Ike's raw stat boosts, Hector's biggest defense boost is based on a percentage of your current defense. So while Ike can make low defense units into decent tanks, Hector really wants to be equipped on a unit who already has high defenses for an extra boost. It's worth noting that on Maddening, this can cause a unit's defense to go too high and not get attacked. I designed this guide around hard mode since I figure that's what more people play, but I feel like Hector has kind of a unique problem here that was worth pointing out. When equipped on a dragon unit, Impenetrable also gives you dodge +50. Remember that dodge means lower crit chances, not lower hit rate, so that actually isn't that good of a buff. Armor units get a 50% defense buff instead of 30, while flying units get a 50% res buff instead of 30, and I personally really like the idea of Hector on a flyer here. Cavalry units get immunity to freeze, which is nice but situational because not all maps have enemies that freeze you. To pair with your high defense, you get Quick Riposte, an inheritable sync skill. Quick Riposte is great on slower units. As long as you have enough HP, 60% at max level, you'll always follow up on attack and defense. Sticking this on a slow tank like Luis ensures he picks up kills on enemy phase, which he'd normally be unable to double and kill. Seriously, this skill was designed for armors, great knights, and other tanky slowpokes. The highest level version only costs 3000 SP too, so it's a pretty reasonable price if you need it for Hectorless builds. This pairs really well with Hector's Engage Attack Storm's Eye. Storm's Eye allows you to take a defensive stance for one turn, applying certain buffs to the unit until your next turn. The primary buff is Immunity to Break, which is really nice if you have Hector on a non-armored tank. It also ensures the enemy cannot double you, decreasing the damage you would take significantly, and allows you to always follow up. You might be saying, but I can always follow up with Quick Riposte. And while that's true, this skill doesn't have an HP threshold, letting you reliably get kills during enemy phase against enemies who would normally drain your health a little too much. When used on a dragon unit, you can prevent one critical hit, though I'd be shocked to find the enemy who is critting you through dodge +50% from Impenetrable. Backup units always get crit +20%, which I honestly think could be really strong if you're defending with a forged killer weapon or something like that. Covert units get an extra 30% avoid, which means they get hit less, which is great because most covert units have low defenses and prefer to be dodge tanks. But we have to talk about Storm's Eye Plus, which you get if you activate Storm's Eye next to Lyn. Basically, this allows you to always attack first as if you had Vantage. I think this significantly improves Storm's Eye, and I pretty much always want to have Lyn around to activate it. The problem I have is that Storm's Eye is an ability that I want to activate in the middle of a group of enemies, and having Lyn around means a lot of those enemies might target her instead. So the positioning is often a little awkward, and while this is theoretically strong, I think you'd have to do some weird stuff with warp staves to get in ideal situations. The other issue with Storm's Eye is that you have to use it with a sword or an axe. This significantly limits its usefulness. Hector's only 1 to 2 range weapon is the Rune Sword, which is magic based and really hurts on a lot of units. So I find that unless I use Hector on an axe unit with hand axes or tomahawks, he's really limited in how effective he can be at tanking and killing with Storm's Eye. Our next skill is Adaptability, which gives you an interesting defense buff. You get 3 defense if you hit with a physical weapon, and 3 res if you hit with a magical attack. The problem is, this buff applies after combat, and you can only have one of these buffs at a time, which makes it really bad against mixed attacking groups. Luckily, this game usually throws pretty homogeneous enemy groups at you aside from a few specific levels, so you're probably fine, but it's worth noting that occasionally adaptability becomes kinda bad. And they know it's bad, which is why it only costs 700 SP to inherit. Then we have Heavy Attack, which could be really good inherited on the right unit. If your unit's build is too low for this weapon's might, it adds excess weight as damage. So sure, you're getting a speed penalty from not having enough build, but the one attack you get to land is stronger for it. I think a few lower build mages might really like this, but as a sync skill, Hector buffs your build, which makes Heavy Attack feel a little mismatched with his stat buffs. Piercing Gauge is a really fun sync skill that makes enemies unable to enter or pass through the tiles diagonal to Hector, cost of 20% of your HP. If Hector could activate this alongside Storm's Eye, it could help push some of his enemies into attacking up close, which would be really cool. But since it drops your whole turn, that won't work. It also costs 20% of your HP, and Quick Riposte will stop working lower than 60%, which gives you a much tighter tanking range before it shuts off. It's a really cool way to corral enemies into Hector and away from allies, but I feel like it conflicts with other parts of his kit sometimes. Next, let's talk about inheritables. Strength and defense are awesome stats that go together, as most physical tanks love both of these stats. And you can inherit this perfect stack boost for the low price of 8,400 SP. You will never have that during a normal game, so it's irrelevant outside of endgame. Axe Guard lets you take less damage from axe units and only costs 1000 SP, but I'd rather have some kind of all-purpose defense boosts, even adaptability. Though I guess axes are technically the highest might weapon in the game, so it's better than Sword or Lance Guard would be, technically. For weapons, Hector gets the Wolf Bane, which is a rapier but an axe. Wow, so cool. What a crazy and unique weapon. The Rune Sword is a magic-based sword that also heals whenever you damage someone. This should be good, healing is great on a tank, but it has a little bit of low might, and it's magic-based on Emblem who doesn't give you a magic buff, so that kinda sucks. It ends up just being kind of okay. The right unit can use it well, but the right unit usually isn't someone you want paired with Hector because they don't have strong defenses. Last we have Armadas, an axe that is effective on dragons and gives you defense plus 5. It's cute, dragon effectiveness is okay, but the defense buff works really well with Hector's kit. If the damn thing could do range attacks, we'd have something really good, but that's still a weakness here. I decided to throw Hector in the B tier, which is kind of low considering how good he should be on paper. I feel like Ike is actually a superior defensive emblem since he works on a wider range of units. Great Aether basically always hits someone who hits you, while Storm's Eye has some serious issues with weapons range on anyone who isn't an axe user. Impenetrable's 30% defense buff is good, but I feel like on most units Ike can actually go higher with his raw defense boosts, and on high defense units Hector is technically better on, both of them are probably taking 0 damage anyway. Hector can be really good on a res tank like Hortensia or something like that, but that also isn't a role you really need to have filled the same way defense tanks are. Look, I'm not saying Hector isn't good, I'm just saying the best part of his kit, Quick Riposte, is inheritable anyways, so maybe just stick it on someone and use Ike instead, they'll probably tank better. Next up, the emblem lost in his books, Soren! Believe it or not, Soren is actually a better tank than Hector. Or Ike. No, seriously, it's because of his engaged skill, Flare. While engaged, Soren decreases the enemy's res by 20% and recovers 50% of the damage he does. The only stipulation that he has to use a tome for this to work, so it won't work with Levin swords, but he conveniently grants you one of those as well. I think Flare is really freaking broken. If Hector is limited to only buffing tank units, Soren is taking units who primarily deal damage and turning them into enemy phase monsters. This makes Soren your absolute best string if you just don't want to play the game. If you've played previous Fire Emblem games, they basically put Nosferatu tanking behind a paywall. Dragon units get their critical hit rate doubled with Flare to make sure they deal lots of damage and fully heal themselves every time. Still wouldn't recommend this with Alier's low magic, but if you happen to have a second dragon unit with high magic somehow, this would make sure they deal lots of damage and always heal themselves. Not like such a unit exists, of course. Mystical units get an extra minus 10% to the foe's res, increasing the damage they do and therefore the health they get back. Again, more damage means more health. And lastly, Qui Adepts units recover 100% of damage dealt instead. Yeah, no, you heard me right. Frame and Jean and basically anyone reclassed love this ability because it makes them basically unkillable. Like, no, this is actually too broken for an emblem ability. I'm sorry, but this is so much stronger than doubling your movement or free dual guards, or anything else you get out of the vanilla game. What the fuck is this shit? But holy shit, we still have other skills to talk about, don't we? Soren has an inheritable sync skill called Assign Decoy, and this one's pretty cool. It lets you target a nearby friend and redirect attacks into him. While Soren isn't engaged and therefore isn't healing himself, this is usually what I have him do. The next 3 attacks will be guaranteed to go into the unit you targeted. There isn't really a good way of redirecting attacks in Fire Emblem and changing enemy attack priority normally. I think this is really good with Ike and Hector to keep people from attacking into your other units. Just watch out because after those 3 attacks, you might be opening up a kind of squishy unit if Soren is out too far. You can also inherit this for 1500 SP in case you need more redirectors in your army. Next, I want to talk about the sync skill Anima Focus. This does different effects depending on the type of magic Soren is using. Fire lowers defense by 3, softening the unit up for a physical attacker to clean up the kill afterwards. Thunder inflicts hit minus 20, making it harder for the enemy to hit you. And Wind decreases movement by 2. They're cool effects, but kind of hard to apply safely since they require you to use tomes, and most tome users are squishy and don't want to leave their enemies alive, which makes the move decrease specifically not that great since Soren would still be in range. The other 2 debuffs usually only go for 1 round of combat before you kill the target because you don't want them attacking Soren. It's also worth noting that you have to use tomes. Magic weapons like the Levin Sword will not activate any buff focus. Next is a skill that I think works okay on Soren but is better inherited onto someone else, Keen Insight. Keen Insight deals extra damage when you deal effective damage. On tome users, this basically just applies to wind magic, and I feel like a lot of physical damage dealers can utilize Keen Insight on a larger variety of enemies. Like, inherit this on any of your Rapier users, or onto your Celica user for Seraphim, and it'll be doing a lot of extra damage. It deals a raw 7 extra damage, which is honestly pretty damn strong. Next up, Soren's engage attack, Cataclysm. This is our first engage attack that is both a multi-hit and an AoE. Soren attacks each enemy 3 times at 40% damage. Each hit uses a different element, meaning it works well with anima focus as every enemy in the AoE will get hit by all 3 debuffs. A wind attack also does effective damage to flyers and also activates Keen Insight, making this a great attack to use on large groups of flying enemies. And since you're engaged, if you're using this, you'll be in a perfect position to use Flare to tank all those enemies, so it honestly doesn't put you in danger the same way activating Anima Focus does normally. Honestly, it feels like Cataclysm really makes Soren's whole kit come together. All this extra damage and debuffs makes so much more sense when applied to an AoE. Dragon units set the targeted terrain on fire, continuing the trend of Dragon synergy being kind of lackluster on DLC units compared to the base game where it's always the best. Mystical units deal an extra 10% damage, meaning you're doing 50% of your damage for a total of 150%, which is really nice on a multi-hit AoE. Qui Adept units have a 20% chance of breaking the enemy, which is pretty strong when attached to an AoE. That's a lot of potential breaks. But of course, if Cataclysm didn't already feel broken, we have Cataclysm Plus. While next Ike Cataclysm gets an increased AoE range, it basically goes from a plus sign to a square. It's not the biggest deal ever, but with Soren's absurd tanking ability while engaged, no one can really touch him, so he's pretty likely to be out on the front lines with Ike. If anything, Ike is less likely to be on the front lines because Soren does his job so much better. Basically, I don't think it's as mismatched as Lyn and Hector, and I think it's a little easier to activate. The boost isn't that big though, so it doesn't really matter, it's just a little bit of extra range. Our final sync skill is the kind of lackluster block recovery. If you attack an enemy who is broken and this skill goes off, that enemy will stay broken after combat. It only works if you attack with a tome though, and the proc chance is based off of speed. Honestly, too many mages are too slow to make this reliable, and a lot of mages will kill, so it's fine. Let's round out our skills with our last couple of inheritables. Magic and Res plus 5, like Hector's Strength and Defense, is a perfect marriage of useful stats, and like Hector's, it's extremely expensive at 8,400. Magic Guard 5 is better than Axe Guard. Again, it only costs 1,000, and units who are weak to magic but have higher physical defense can use this to patch up their weakness in a similar way to Bow Guard on a flyer. It's not like Axe Guard, where there are a bunch of other weapon types you aren't protecting against that do the same type of damage, so Magic Guard is pretty good, though it's worth noting that Magic Guard only protects against tomes, not magic weapons, so there are some rare cases where enemies can get around Magic Guard and still attack your res. Next we have weapons. Soren's first weapon is Bolting, a thunder magic tome that attacks at long range. This is huge. Long range tomes were enemy exclusive before this, and Lyn's Astrostorm was the only real way to deal long range damage. Soren having access to long range damage that can be activated across multiple turns or dance to attack more than once is huge. Unfortunately, you cannot follow up with Bolting, which really hurts its kill capabilities. And honestly, Soren's such a good tank that it's hard to justify wasting engaged turns with long range magic. I think it's really good as a way of attacking and applying a hit debuff to a specific enemy or eliminating a specific threat from far away, and then dancing Soren so you can charge out there with one less enemy who can hit him. It isn't quite as good at securing kills as Astrostorm, trading damage for consistency over multiple turns. Next is Reflect, a staff that causes all allies around Soren to reflect 50% of the magic damage they take back to their foes. I think counter skills in Fire Emblem are usually a lot better on enemies than in the hands of a player, but you can definitely still make Reflect work. It's it's a little awkward because the damage you deal to your enemy is directly based on how much you take, so it doesn't really work on high res units, but it also doesn't really work on low res units. You basically need high HP to make this work. Last is Rexcalibur. This is a strong wind tome that deals effective damage to flyers. This is really helpful on units who don't have tome access normally, such as this Swordmaster Citrian I've been running Soren on. But most of the time, if your unit has tomes, you probably don't want Rexcalibur over Forges. Soren is absolutely going to the top of $29.99 tier with Tiki. If we're comparing the two, I think Soren belongs above Tiki. Tiki totally breaks the game by letting you buff growths and turning a unit into a monster. But Soren just trivializes the entire game by making it easier than Sacred Stones, especially if you find the right magic unit to throw him on. I think you can make an argument for Tiki being higher because Tiki makes more units broken, but doesn't make them quite as broken as Soren does. But I think Soren's just on another level here. Okay, we all knew she'd get in. It's time to talk about Camilla. Ugh. Like Corrin, Camilla gets access to Dragon Veins as a sync skill. However, some of Camilla's Dragon Veins are different from Corrin's. For example, instead of getting Fog, Covert units get Smoke, which decrease the enemy's defense and Avoid. Instead of creating Ice Pillars, Qui-Adept units create an Ice Floor. This floor buffs your movement, so make sure you create the floor before you move your units. Ending your turn on these tiles will do nothing for you, which totally makes sense but is counterintuitive to how terrain works, usually in Fire Emblem, so I figured it would be worth mentioning. Everything else is mostly the same, just in different patterns from Corrin. Cavalry still gets water that decreases Avoid, backup creates stone pillars that buff defense and res, armored units create vines that give you immunity to break, flying units create a healing area, and mystical units create flames. Dragon units, like with Corrin, get to use whatever they want, whenever they want. It's worth mentioning that a lot of these negative terrain effects are placed on Camilla's tile, which can hurt. Luckily, Camilla gets Groundswell, which clears negative effects she's standing on and heals her for 10 HP for the trouble. So for a lot of her offensive abilities, she can hurt everyone around her and get a free heal out of it. Next we have Soar, our Engage skill. When Camilla engages, this skill gives you an extra 2 movement and changes your unit into a flying unit. This has all kinds of crazy uses. Obviously the movement buff isn't as huge as of a distance as Sigurd, but allowing your units to fly over any kind of terrain without being weak to bows and archers is really powerful. I've been playing with this on Seadal, for example, because having a dancer who can travel with my flyers is really fun, lets me do all kinds of silly things I couldn't before. There's one small downside though, which is that if your engage ends while you're on impassable terrain, you'll be placed on the nearest terrain you stand on. So keep an eye on that timer and make sure you don't accidentally end up teleporting yourself into a big group of enemies or something. Cavalry units get an extra 2 move, making the movement buff more comparable to Sigurd's. Flying units get 1 extra move, which usually doesn't make up for the fact that they aren't getting anything out of turning into a flying unit, since you already are one and keep your weakness. The really weird synergy is Dragon though. If the Dragon unit initiates combat, they deal damage to all enemies within 2 spaces of the enemy they attacked, with the damage being based on HP. This is a totally different skill tacked onto the synergy for Soar, but it's definitely very strong, and between this and having all the Dragon Veins, Dragon units are actually good on this DLC emblem. I think Soar and Dragon Vein paint a picture of how Camilla is supposed to be used compared to Corrin. Dragon Veins like Camilla's fire and smoke spread out all around her, which makes it harder to use while near your allies, but if you throw Camilla out kind of far afield, she can use her more offensive Dragon Veins really well. And the movement buff from Soar and the healing from Groundswell both help her do that. Her engage attack, Dark Inferno, also plays into this playstyle. This attacks every single unit in the AoE for full damage and creates fire on those tiles. Pattern is this kind of checkerboard that hits every other square in a grid. The attack is activated with her axe, and Camilla has a few decent options for axes if you didn't bring your own. Dragon units get an increased area of effect, letting you hit more enemies. Mystical units deal an extra 20% damage from your initial hits, and Qui-Adept units add a healing glow to a few units around Camilla. I think the healing glow is a little difficult to utilize with the fire, but in the right circumstances it can be pretty strong, whereas the dragon and mystical synergies are pretty universally strong. Dark Inferno Plus is really strong too. It basically changes the AoE from the checkerboard to the entire square around Camilla. That's a hell of a lot of units to hit and much easier to hit with. The problem is that with all that fire, you usually want to activate Dark Inferno away from your army, and the new AoE means the square Corrin is standing on will be affected too. Still, it isn't bad if you haven't moved Corrin yet, since Corrin can activate her own Dragon Vein to override the fire and potentially activate Camilla's Groundswell or buff herself against the incoming horde. We got 2 more sync skills before we move on to Inheritables. Decisive Strike deals 10 damage to the foe after combat if you land a critical hit and initiate it. The problem is that this is after combat damage, and if your unit still isn't killing after a crit, you have bigger problems that 10 damage won't solve. It's just not going off that often since most of the time when you crit, you kill. Detoxify cures poison at the start of your turn, which is nice, but not really game-changing as poison doesn't really feel that meaningful most of the time. Then on to inheritables. Speed and res +5 is okay. I think I'd prefer speed on my offenses, but the General and Great Knight class have low speed and res, so this helps those units I suppose. Lance Guard has all the same problems as Axe Guard, and honestly I don't see much point in it. For weapons, we get the Bolt Axe. This axe can counter at either 1 or 2 range and deals magical damage. Camilla doesn't get a magic buff from her stats, just res, speed, and HP. So I feel like the Bolt Axe damage is really low on non-magic users, and magic users usually have plenty of other magic weapons they can use. Next we have Lightning, a tome that deals brave damage. Magic users do like this because outside of very specific and hard to get bond rings, there's no way to deal brave damage with magic. For those who don't know what brave damage is, I'm saying it to attack twice if you initiate combat, similar to brave swords, lances, and axes. Magic units with Camilla will probably use this more than any other of her weapons. Last we have Camilla's Axe. This axe increases your res by 10, the largest single stat buff we've ever seen. Tearfing is crying. It also deals bonus damage based on your opponent's defense minus your opponent's res. So if you're fighting armor or other units with a large discrepancy between their defense and res, this will do a hell of a lot of damage. Your physical Camilla units will get a lot of fun use out of this. Camilla was a challenging emblem to rank. I do think her Dragon Veins are a little weaker than Soren due to not having Ice Walls and Fog, and the shapes are a little harder to use and more conducive to playing her solo instead of support. But then, getting that extra movement buff and the ability to make units into flying units is power creeping the fuck out of Sigurd. Sure, she doesn't go as far, but her other utility is amazing and Sigurd pretty much just has movement. I'm placing her in S tier, but below Soren in S. She's not quite broken enough to be with Tiki and Soren, but she competes with the best of the best in the vanilla game. You think she can be a little hard to figure out how to use right, but once you do, she's going to do a lot. And this brings us to the end of another video. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider subscribing, it really helps. I'm working on some stuff in my personal life lately, that's why this video came out a little later than I wanted, but I finally have my first appointment with an endocrinologist next Friday to start HRT. I know you don't care, I'm just happy. Anyways, I have some unexpected new Fire Emblem videos coming up, so those will be coming soon. You won't want to miss them. Bye!